For roughly 300,000 years, every human being on Earth survived by tracking their food. We were nomads, moving constantly across the landscape to follow seasonal vegetation and wild game. Then, about 12,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, bands of hunter-gatherers noticed a scraggly wild grass called einkorn. The kernels were tiny and required back-breaking labor to separate from the stalk. But those hard grains offered a biological advantage that meat and berries did not. Dried grain did not rot. You could harvest it in the fall, seal it in a clay jar, and eat it in the dead of winter when the landscape had frozen over. Tapping into that calorie reserve required a trade-off. You cannot plant a field in the spring, walk away for 6 months to chase antelope, and expect your crop to survive until autumn. To secure the grain, humans had to stay put. We had to pull weeds, keep birds away, and build walls to protect the storage pits from animals. Because of the specific biological demands of this plant, people constructed permanent homes. Villages formed directly around the wheat fields, eventually swelling into massive early settlements like Jericho and Catalhoyuk, which held thousands of people. The archaeological record suggests a biological exchange. Wheat provided a reliable food supply, but only on the condition that the human species stopped moving and dedicated its labor to tending the fields. As populations concentrated in these new permanent settlements, wheat evolved into literal currency. The ancient Egyptians ran their sophisticated economy without coins. Workers were paid in grain, taxes were collected in grain, and debts were settled in grain. To survive the unpredictable highs and lows of the Nile's annual floods, the pharaohs built sprawling stone granaries and invent the complex bureaucratic machinery required to track, store, and redistribute those surpluses. That stored wealth paid for the largest construction projects on Earth. The Great Pyramid at Giza was built by organized laborers, many of them seasonal farmers working during the flood season. Their wages were bread and beer, supplied by dozens of industrial bakeries running constantly near the construction site. Centuries later, the Roman state faced a steep logistical cliff. To keep 1 million urban citizens fed and prevent violent riots in the capital, Rome engineered the Annona, a sprawling, state-run supply chain. Fleets of cargo ships constantly hauled requisitioned and taxed wheat from Egypt and North Africa across the Mediterranean just to provide daily, state-subsidized bread to the city. The sheer volume of calories required to keep dense urban populations alive forced early societies to invent centralized administration, taxation, and long-distance maritime logistics. By the Middle Ages, European society had organized itself entirely around the seasonal rhythm of this crop. Bread was the absolute center of the medieval diet, and the wheat that produced it formed the base layer of the feudal system. Serfs worked the land, and the grain they harvested fed the lord's household and funded his military. The local lord usually owned the only grain mill in the territory, and serfs were legally obligated to use it. Grinding your own wheat with a handstone at home was heavily restricted or illegal. Every time a peasant turned their harvest into edible flour, they had to pay a mandatory milling fee to the lord. Because human survival required bread, controlling the choke point between raw grain and flour gave the lord significant political and social leverage over everyone in his territory. As European colonizers expanded across the globe, they brought their dietary reliance on wheat with them. In 1862, the U.S. government opened the American Great Plains to millions of settlers. These immigrant farmers tore up the deep-rooted, drought-resistant native prairie grasses that had anchored the topsoil for millennia, replacing them with horizons of familiar European wheat. Decades of aggressive, mechanized plowing stripped the land of its natural defenses. The new wheat plants had shallow roots, offering no grip on the earth. When a severe, multi-year drought struck the southern plains in the 1930s, the exposed soil dried into a loose powder. With nothing holding the dirt in place, intense winds picked up millions of tons of topsoil, forming massive black blizzards called dust storms. These clouds blotted out the sun, smothered livestock in the fields, and carried fine grit all the way to the east coast. Entire farms were swallowed by drifting dunes of dirt. Over 2 million people abandoned the region, driving west in search of any available work, while those who stayed faced a fatal condition called dust pneumonia, as their lungs filled with the constant grit in the air. The southern plains had survived severe droughts before, but humanity's attempt to force a fragile, alien monoculture onto a resilient native ecosystem resulted in the worst human-made ecological disaster in American history. By the 1960s, the global population was growing much faster than the food supply. In India and Pakistan, severe famine seemed mathematically inevitable, and international policymakers openly debated which nations would simply starve. The solution came from an American plant scientist named Norman Borlaug. He bred a new semi-dwarf variety of wheat. These plants were shorter, meaning they spent less energy growing tall stalks and more energy producing heavy, disease-resistant grain. When farmers planted Borlaug's seeds, crop yields exploded. The resulting agricultural boom, known as the Green Revolution, nearly doubled wheat production in South Asia in just 5 years, saving an estimated 1 billion people from starvation. But those massive yields exact a heavy, ongoing toll. Borlaug's dwarf wheat demands massive applications of synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides to survive. It also requires immense volumes of water, aggressively draining deep underground aquifers to maintain constant irrigation. We averted a global famine, but the price of that survival was locking our agricultural system into an intensive cycle of chemical dependency. Today, wheat covers roughly 220 million hectares of the planet's surface across 6 continents. It provides approximately 20% of all the calories human beings consume worldwide. This chart illustrates a critical vulnerability. Wheat is highly sensitive to temperature shifts. For every 1 degree Celsius increase in global temperature, yields drop roughly 6%. Losing that 6% puts the food supply for nearly 100 million people at risk. The political leverage attached to the grain supply also remains intact. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the immediate disruption to wheat exports sent a price shock through the Middle East and North Africa, threatening the stability of nations in exactly the same way Egypt once held leverage over Rome. 12,000 years ago, a small group of hunter-gatherers were just trying to make it through the winter. They entered a relationship where wheat dictated our geography, structured our laws, and drove our ecological footprint. We plant the seeds, but wheat is still calling the shots.